Midnight approaches, and as all the lights within the city are extinguished, you manage to find your way down a dark alley just by the smell of it, just by the sense of the cobbles underneath your boots. You reach a familiar door. You've been here before. You knock on it, and without a sound, it swings open. You are bathed in candlelight. You step inside and quickly shut the door behind you. You pull back your hood and look around. You see familiar faces. You are here as often as they are, gambling, eating, drinking, enjoying some paid company, while the rest of the city sleeps. You are in one of the ancient Roman Taverns. Gambling is illegal. So is prostitution. But you're here nonetheless. Welcome. Welcome everyone to Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your weekly dose of miniature painting, history and world building. Today we'll be talking about taverns and inns, or at least their forefathers in ancient times. Before we move on, let us talk about the miniature. This is Han, the Dragon Lee monk from Animal Adventures Tales of Cats and Catacombs. And with that, let us begin. I sincerely believe that this subject is a cornerstone of world building. Understanding how taverns and inns work allows us to bring more flavor to our worlds, create more situations that are going to impress our players, and why not bring even more life to our worlds. Before we start, I'm gonna break down the subjects for today. We're gonna talk about Kaupone and Taberne, Popinae and Thermopolie. These are places to eat and drink. And when it comes to places where one can find accommodations in the ancient world, we're gonna be talking about hospitia, stabule, and mansiones. Hopefully we're gonna get through them quite quickly with a lot of explanation and details, so we could at least finish the ancient world and then move on to something we're more familiar with, medieval times. Before we begin, let us talk about the miniature for a second. Right now I'm using white to give the miniature a soft white underbelly, while also base painting the necklace around its neck. Kaupone and Taberne. First off, Taberne. These are the precursors of taverns. This is where the original name comes from and the function, the basic function of such an establishment. There is one difference between the two. Although they are very similar in function, in Kaupone you could also, perhaps depending on the location and the proprietor, perhaps could rent a sleeping spot. I'm not talking about a full room or a bed, just a sleeping spot somewhere within it. Both served meals, both served drinks, and both had a bad reputation of gambling and prostitution. Some Kaupone and Taberne also, depending on the proprietor, the settlement they were in and the available space, had a few tables and stools for individuals to eat and of course to gamble. There is one example in Pompeii where a Kaupone was unearthed, and it was a little bit higher class, as it had formal dining tables and couches around it. Not many examples survived, so this is quite interesting, as it shows that although these establishments had a bad reputation, there were still some upper class places where individuals could go and have a nice meal. Moving on, let's talk about the Thermopolia. Thermopolia were very small places, usually attached to Kaupona or Taberna, and people could stop and grab a hot drink and a warm snack on the go. They had L-shaped counters right against the entrance, and it's just like a modern day drive-thru. You'd stop, order, grab your food and just go. So these were quite common, especially Thermopolia. Before we move on, let us talk about the miniature for a second. With a darker shade of brown, I am detailing the face of the miniature, darkening the tips of its ears and adding dark brown stripes to its fur wherever visible. Let us continue. Popinae. Popinae were ancient Roman bars for the lowest class of society. They would often serve very cheap wine, olives, bread and stews. Most of them were frequented by unsavory individuals, such as very low-class citizens, beggars, and even slaves. Rarely did they have tables or stools. People would stand while grabbing a cup of very cheap wine, very cheap sour wine usually. And if you were lucky and the place was doing really well, you would find perhaps a tall stool against the counter, like a modern day bar stool. But usually people would just pack in, grab a drink, grab a snack, and go about their business. In the late 1st century, early 2nd century, the Roman poet Juvenal mentioned such an eatery in Ostia, the ancient port city of Rome. He said that the crowd inside was made of thieves, sailors, coffin makers, fugitive slaves, assassins, and the priest of Cybele. Cybele was an ancient Roman goddess imported from the Middle East. We're gonna talk about her during another video at another time. So as you can see, in such establishments, the most unsavory crowd could be found. Here people would gamble and would often fight. As you can see, a most unsavory crowd. And with that, we've covered the basic establishments where one could eat or drink. Let's talk about the activities that went inside. Gambling. Gambling was officially illegal in ancient Roman times, depending on the century, but almost throughout the Roman history it was illegal. Most gambling was done in the form of dice games. We know that these activities went on inside Taberne and Popinae if they were larger, and Kaupone, because those unearthed in Pompeii produced great quantity of dice. And either people didn't care about the prohibition on gambling, or they were very, very into dice collecting. Now, I can't speak for them, but I know I have a lot of dice. In the 1st century, in 41 CE, the Emperor Claudius outlawed all Taberne, Popinae, Thermopolie, and Kaupone. He decreed that these places have to be shut down as they were places where illegal activities were performed, and they were places where enemies of the state would gather and plot against the government. Of course, this was, although it was an imperial decree, this could not come to pass. Eateries and places to drink were too popular for them to simply vanish. As you all know, even during the American Prohibition, people didn't stop drinking alcohol, they simply stopped doing it openly. The same thing happened after Claudius's decree. Before we move along, let us talk about how the painting is coming along. Right now I am adding yellow and black details to the waistband, as I really like the contrast between the two colors. I'm also adding more detail to the eyes. Let us continue. Perhaps you're wondering why. Why were people frequenting places that had a bad reputation? Why were they grabbing food from Popinae and passing by sailors and thieves and priests of Cybele? Why were they going into these places and why were they so popular? The answer is quite simple and might be a bit surprising. First off, right off the bat, let's get it out of the way. People enjoy eating together, as I've mentioned at the start of this video. People enjoy spending time together, drinking together, having fun together. But there's also another reason. In ancient Roman times, most houses within larger cities, such as Rome, Ostia, Pompeii, Herculaneum, etc., were very crammed. And most houses, most homes, were inside insulae. Insulae were ancient apartment buildings. And in these apartment buildings, you wouldn't have a kitchen. You wouldn't have the necessary means of cooking your own food. There was always the risk of fire, which was one of the biggest threats in ancient Roman times, especially in Rome. But you wouldn't have enough room to have a properly equipped kitchen. As such, you had to go grab something cheap and something quick. Bring back, eat in your own home or eat out. This created a social context for these establishments to flourish. And it wasn't only limited to ancient Rome. You find the same examples in Greece, in Egypt. One of the oldest examples of such an establishment comes from the Code of Hammurabi in ancient Babylon from 1750 BCE. So almost 3,770 years ago, where they mentioned that the penalty for a proprietor of a drinking establishment that would sell watered down beer would be death. So as you can see, there were rules about these establishments going back almost 3,700 years ago. And this is just what we've discovered through archaeological studies, through historical studies. People have always enjoyed eating in the company of others, and if you had a small hovel, if you were living in one room, you wouldn't have the necessary facilities to cook. And why would you? When you could just go out and for a few coins, you could grab enough food to allow you to go on for a day and be in the company of others, especially people of the same station as you are. And with that, let us take a look at what they looked like. As in modern times, people tried to lure clients in. As such, they would decorate the front of their shops as best as they could. In Pompeii, we see examples of floral motifs, animal motifs, geometric motifs. We have signs that invited people in. In ancient Pompeii and Herculaneum, you would find Popinae lining the busiest streets in the city and commercial areas, and they would have their counter right at the entrance. So again, as I mentioned before, you would simply stop, grab a drink, grab some food, and go about your business. The most examples of counters that we have were between 2.5 meters or 6 to 8 feet long, L-shaped. You would find dolia, large pots inset in the counters that would hold dried fruits, nuts, pulse, and olives for people to snack on, And behind these counters you would find a small cooking fire over which the staff would cook food to order. And with that, we've covered the most basic ancient taverns and the grandfathers of restaurants. Now let us talk about sleeping accommodations in ancient times. But before we do so, let us talk about the miniature for a brief moment. With everything else done, I am using lighter shades of brown to bring more detail to the leather pieces on the legs, making the leather look a little bit more worn, cracked a little bit. When it comes to sleeping accommodations, we had three types: hospitia, stabula, mansiones. Let's detail each and every one of them, and you will see how modern day hotels and motels came to be. Hospitia. These were rented rooms in houses, in private houses. Imagine like an Airbnb. The name derives from the principle of hospitality, hospitia. Slowly but surely, whole properties would be bought out by wealthy individuals, and rooms would be rented out. Food would have been provided for those renting rooms. You would also have formal dining rooms, you would have an atrium, and you would have a triclinium. Triclinium would be a dining table with sofas, with couches around it, on which you could lean while feasting. Sleeping spots, depending on the location, the proprietor, and so on, would either be rooms where one or more people could sleep, depending on the price and those who were renting the rooms, or it could simply be a sleeping spot on the floor of a room shared with multiple individuals. The second kind would be the stabula. These were usually Roman inns that would be found at the entrance of cities or settlements. They would, as opposed to the hospitia, they would also be able to house animals, to stable animals. They would usually have a ramp onto the street going up for an ease of access for pack animals and carts. The animals would be stabled in inner courtyard, and around the stables you could find the latrines and the kitchen. And the last kind of sleeping accommodations were the mansiones. Mansiones were created along the vast network of roads that the Romans created throughout their territory, throughout history. The name derives from manere, which means to remain, to expect. These were places where messengers initially were able to rest their animals, or if need be, swap their horse for a fresh one and continue on their way. Slowly these evolved to allow travelers to also take shelter, pay for accommodation, pay for services, and slowly but surely small settlements actually evolved alongside these inns, these mansiones. As you could imagine, these places had to be provided for somehow, and besides being supplied by the state or by the proprietor of such an establishment, having people live around it meant that you would also be able to provide locally for the staff and travelers. Moreover, such places became hubs of information and trade because they could also be found at intersections, at crossroads. And as such, they became important elements in the Roman society, and later on throughout medieval times, they have an influence across history. And with that, let's talk about the miniature for a bit. With everything done and finished, I am wrapping things up by adding a coat of matte varnish on the whole miniature, with the exception of the potion bottle and the necklace around its neck, where I'm using glossy varnish. And with that, we'll conclude today's episode. I truly hope that you found a bit of inspiration, or at least found out something new. Next time, we're gonna continue our journey through the history of medieval inns, those that we usually stumble upon in D&D, for example. And with that, thank you so much for the privilege of your time. Please like, subscribe, share, leave a comment, hit the bell, and I'll see you all here next week on Funky Monkey Mini Painting. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful evening. Cheers.